Good evening. Hi, it's nice to see all of you here this evening. And welcome to New College. I know many of you have been here before, and we're always delighted to have people from the community, friends, neighbors, faculty, students join us for these wonderful evenings. I just wanted to share a little bit about New College. We're growing. And we are growing by 50% in our faculty and 50% in our student body. We're about 850 students now, and we aspire to be at about 1,200, so still small, but a little bit deeper in our student body. And we are just in the process of hiring 15 new faculty members who will join us in the fall. So we're very excited for the academics and for new colleagues. So it's a place that's on the move, and we hope you'll come join us for other events. I didn't say, I'm Mary Young, and I'm the director of the New College Foundation, and really happy to be part of this community here. This is our last new topics for this year, and we're working on speakers for next year, so we'll be sure to keep you posted. I think one of the things I wanted to just share briefly is we've been having this marvelous Frankenfest conversation and events on campus since January and go right through the end of April. So this evening is one of those celebrations for us, and we're so thrilled to have Marilyn with us. I'm going to introduce my colleague Miriam Wallace, who is English professor and the chair of our Humanities Division here at New College, and she'll introduce our speaker. So thank you for being with us.
So welcome, everyone. I am delighted to be able to be here to introduce a colleague and a longtime friend. I'm Miriam Wallace, professor of English, currently serving as chair of the Division of Humanities. And Dr. Marilyn Francus, who's coming to us from West Virginia University. I always want to say University of West Virginia, which is incorrect. We've known each other for quite a long time through the American Society for 18th Century Studies, which is a professional group we both go to, and the Women's Caucus there, which is very active. And in fact, Frankenfest is kind of her fault, because we were talking at a conference and she said, here's what I would do for the 200th anniversary of Frankenstein if I had the energy and the time and so forth. And I thought, what a great idea. I don't think I have the energy either. And then I thought, well, maybe I do. But that made me really want to invite her to come speak. And I just want to give you a tiny bit of information. She's a specialist in 18th century British literature and culture, women's studies, satire, history of the novel. Her most recent book, I have it here, Monstrous Motherhood, 18th Century Culture and the Ideology of Domesticity, picks up on the monstrous mother. It looks at maternal demonization and erasure in Great Britain from 1660 to 1820. But I also want to mention, if I have any Jane Austen fans in the house, Dr. Francus is a Jane Austen expert and a Frances Burney expert as well. And if you don't know Burney but you love Austen, you should definitely read Burney. We were just talking the other night about JASNA, which is the Jane Austen Society of North America, which is a really interesting group that combines academics and just ordinary people who are fans. And she can tell you more about that if we have time. But for now, I just want to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Marilyn Francus.
Thank you. It's delightful to be here. I'm trying to figure out the clicker. There we go. At New College, I'd like to thank Miriam Wallace, the people at the foundation, all of you, Jeff and his tech dudes who make all of this possible. While Shelley's novel Frankenstein has been a touchstone text for discussions of science fiction, horror, medical ethics, monstrosity, and adaptation, as the events in this Frankenfest make evident, today I'd like to discuss with you Frankenstein in terms of motherhood. My goal is not only to celebrate the achievement of Mary Shelley's novel, but to encourage you to think about motherhood, specifically to discuss the ways that literature shapes and reflects our understanding of motherhood, and the ways that Frankenstein comments on motherhood and shapes modern discussions of the subject in what are commonly known as the mommy wars. My talk will have 4 parts. First, some biography by discussing Mary Shelley and her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft. Second, some literary history regarding the composition of Frankenstein. Third, a discussion of motherhood in Shelley's novel. And last but not least, some of the implications of Frankenstein for our modern mommy wars. There's Mary Wollstonecraft, portrait in the National Portrait Gallery of London. It's a nice face. I'd like to spend the next few minutes talking about what it meant to be the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, a radical and a feminist. There are a number of points in Wollstonecraft's biography that are relevant for our discussion. First, and not surprisingly, Wollstonecraft was not a typical conventional mother of the period, to put it mildly. She defied convention for years by resisting marriage. Her first child, Fanny, was born out of wedlock from her liaison with an American, those Americans, an American named Gilbert Imlay. And Fanny was born on May 14th, 1794, when Wollstonecraft was 35 years old. And back then, that was not a typical age to be a first-time mother. Second, Wollstonecraft was a working mother. She wrote a history of the French Revolution while she was pregnant with Fanny, which she finished and published not long after Fanny was born. Then she traveled to Scandinavia with her infant daughter to do business and wrote her letters written in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, which was published in 1796, along the way. Now, there were many working-class mothers in the period. Women who worked as cooks, seamstresses, nannies, washerwomen, and in the face of financial need, women working outside the home was accepted. But it was unusual for middle-class women and upper-class women to work for pay outside the home in the public sphere. Actresses and singers began to achieve middle-class status at the end of the 18th century, and the public performative nature of their work was accepted. There are only a few actresses and performers who are mothers. Among the most famous are Sarah Siddons, the famous tragic actress, and Dorothy Jordan, the famous comic actress. But being a mother and an actress was far from commonplace. And occasionally it led to very unusual situations, such as Sarah Siddons playing Lady Macbeth visibly pregnant, which changed like the entire meaning of the play. So, among the professional options for middle-class women, you could write, and writing was done at home, and that was acceptable. But to earn a living as a writer, you have to get published. And the minute you publish, you're in the public sphere and open to public discussion and commentary. There are many women in the 18th century who publish anonymously. That's not surprising. Every now and then, a woman writer who is a mother just out and out puts her maternity right in front of her work. Perhaps the most famous case of this is Charlotte Smith, who is not so famous today, but back in the day she was a very well-known novelist who in the prefaces of her novels would explain how she was writing to support her 10 children. Occasionally she also wrote about her no-good husband who abandoned them and his financial mismanagement, but more often than not, women writers were not mothers, and if they were mothers, they were not announcing that fact as professionals. So, the social expectation in the late 18th century, and again, this tends to be really class-based, was that women were domestic and their tasks centered on the home and the private sphere, while men functioned in the public sphere. And this expectation is repeated in conduct manuals, in sermons, in educational tracts, and it gets reinforced by a lot of mainstream literature in the period. Daughters were domestic. Maiden aunts were domestic. Unmarried sisters were domestic. But the archetypal domestic woman was a mother. And the expectations of domestic women are what you might expect for the period. Care for your children, supervise the servants on the assumption that you have servants because you're middle class or higher, defer to your husband, be dutiful, religious, economical but not stingy, modest, chaste, well-behaved, charitable, this is a long list, and sensitive to the needs of others. That's domestic mother. Now, the binary of private domestic woman and public man largely signals an ideological preference. And it was not as fixed as it would seem, certainly not in practice. Middle and upper class women ventured into the world for a variety of reasons. To start with, they were consumers of goods and they went shopping. They attended theater, exhibits, concerts. So women affected the economy and the culture. Women attended church and increasingly were engaged in public philanthropy by the end of the century. And on the other side, men were very much interested in domestic expenses, raising their children, household goods, and how things were run. But that binary, which is cultural shorthand, is resilient. And the expectations of maternal behavior, again, that domestic, deferential, modest, they were used to judge women. And they justified a kind of maternal displacement and maternal self-erasure, as women were encouraged to put their husbands and children first. The domestic standard regulated mothers and encouraged mothers to be self-regulating. Mothers were expected to engage in domestic work and the work of parenting without discussing it or drawing attention to their efforts. In fact, there's one early conduct manual where the writer says to his daughter, if you talk about your children in public, it's like putting them out to perish. It's like treating them as if they were charity cases. Don't talk about your kids in public. By the way, this doesn't mean that women didn't talk about their kids. They did all the time. There's lots of diaries and correspondence to show that. But the public persona of a mother was not supposed to evince that position or that data. So, to put this differently, the good, I would put that in quotes, the good, socially sanctioned mother was a woman whose narrative was displaced by that of her family. She was not a protagonist. She enabled others to be protagonists and to have stories. Now, the bad mother, because there's always a bad mother, was the woman who drew attention to herself, her efforts as a parent, and her needs as an individual. The bad mother was monstrous in the etymological sense of the term. The word monstrous shares the same root as demonstrate. It comes from the Latin monstrare, which means to show. So the monstrous mother demonstrates herself, and she demonstrates her motherhood. She's also monstrous in the conventional sense, in the sense that she elicits horror and fear. She acts out. And the term monster is also etymologically related to the Latin monere, a warning. The monstrous mother is a warning about the fragility of the family, about the challenges of parenting, about the risks of not supporting mothers, and the risk of not acknowledging the maternal self. Wollstonecraft, and you were going to get back to her. Wollstonecraft, with her public persona, defied the gender stereotype of the private, self-effacing domestic woman constantly. She was a socially unsanctioned mother. She was a bad, monstrous mother by this definition. Not only because she defied convention and gave birth to an illegitimate child, and then she became pregnant by another man and became pregnant out of wedlock, although she eventually married him, but because Wollstonecraft refused to engage in self-erasure as a woman or as a mother. As a middle-class working woman, Wollstonecraft had significant work experience in childcare prior to her own mothering experience. She established a school, which did not succeed, sadly, and she worked as a governess in Ireland, which she hated. It's worth noting that Both of those professions were often taken up by educated middle-class women who were struggling against downward mobility, for they were domestic. The governess teaches children at home, or at least quasi-domestic in the sense of teaching children, albeit not at home but in a school. Wollstonecraft published works on education and child rearing before she became a parent. Her thoughts on the education of daughters, which came out in 1787, and Original Stories in 1788, are mainstays of the field at the time. And in the latter, her governess heroine, Mrs. Mason, suggests that parents have no clue on how to raise their children. And that's why they need governesses. In her most famous work, The Vindication of the Rights of Woman, Wollstonecraft comments on gender expectations and domestic ideology and its negative effects on women. And she argues for educating mothers so they could raise children to be valued citizens. What she's mostly concerned about is that women are being treated as children and that women get infantilized by men. And she argues that such women can't raise children. In order to have good citizens and a good nation and a growing nation, you have to educate women to educate the children. Now, Wollstonecraft, remember, she's pregnant with her second child out of wedlock. She marries this gentleman, William Godwin, who was a famed radical in his own right, who is probably best known today for his inquiry concerning political justice and his novel Caleb Williams, both of which were published in the 1790s. He wasn't fond of marriage, she wasn't fond of marriage, but they decided to get married simply because of the fallout from her pregnancy with Gilbert Imlay. The negative social ramifications were just so difficult, they decided, okay, we're gonna get married. I don't like it, you don't like it, but we'll do it. Mary Wollstonecraft marries Godwin, and she gives birth to a daughter named Mary on August 30th, 1797. And she died 11 days later, on September 10th, from puerperal fever, which was often contracted by women because of the unsanitary conditions of the labor room. Now, I want to suggest that when you're the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, and partly the cause of her death, you are carrying an unusually potent maternal legacy. And I think it would be fair to say that Mary Shelley was haunted by her mother, who she never really knew other than by reading her mother's writings. That's Mary Shelley, also another portrait from the National Portrait Gallery in London. In addition to her maternal legacy, I want to note some other factors that shaped Mary, at this point Godwin, Shelley's, early years and her perception of motherhood. Her father published memoirs of his dead wife. It's got a long title, The Memoirs of the Author of the Vindication of the Rights of Woman. In 1798, this was just months after Wollstonecraft died. And it only made Wollstonecraft more notorious because Godwin was completely forthright about his dead wife's sexual history, which, as you might imagine, colored the way people perceived Wollstonecraft's works and ideas and her daughter. In 1801, when Mary was 4, William Godwin married his neighbor, Mary Jane Claremont. Claremont was a widow with 2 children. Godwin was taking care of Fanny Imlay, his daughter Mary, and eventually the 2 of them had a son together. So it's kind of like, if you remember that old movie, Yours, Mine, and Ours, that's kind of what this is. Mary hated her stepmother. I can't say that. There is no nice way to put that. We know the problems that are associated with stepmotherhood and the ways that stepmotherhood comments on mothering and the ways that stereotypes of stepmothers complicate and make surrogacy difficult. Think of fairy tales, think of folk tales, think of Disney movies like Cinderella. We have a long cultural history of finding the stepmother figure problematic. That's what Mary is living with. She was educated by her father, given a kind of masculine education for the time, and she was a voracious reader. And not surprisingly, she had access to the radical intelligentsia in England who visited her father fairly regularly. This is when the soap opera part of the narrative comes. Mary Godwin met Percy Shelley, who was a fan of William Godwin's work, in November 1812. She was 15 years old. He was 20 and married to Harriet Westbrook. A year and a half later, in May 1814, Mary began a relationship with Percy Shelley, who was still married. And that July, Mary and Percy Shelley eloped to Europe. Mary was almost 17, and her father did not approve, to put this mildly. There are radicals and then there are radicals. This was too radical for William Godwin. They returned to England in September 1814, and at the end of that November, Harriet Shelley, Percy Shelley's wife, gives birth to Charles, her second child with Percy Shelley. So you got this, right? Now, it's important to note Mary's maternal status at this time. As the chronology shows, Mary Godwin was pregnant for most of 1815. She gave birth prematurely in February and became pregnant again almost immediately, presumably in April, because her first son, William, was born in January 1816. When she started writing Frankenstein, Mary was nursing and tending to her infant son. And she became pregnant again, presumably in January 1817, since she gave birth to a daughter, Clara, in September 1817. So like her mother, Mary Shelley was a working mother, a caregiver, and an author as she was writing her novel. And it's important to note that the many deaths that Mary will grapple with begin at this time. Not only the death of her premature daughter, but the suicides of Shelley's wife, Harriet, and it's a little disturbing how rapidly she marries Shelley after Harriet commits suicide, but there it is. And the suicide of Mary's half-sister, Fanny Imlay. And there are going to be more deaths to come. Although at the time of writing Frankenstein, Mary Shelley does not know that by 1823, her son William will die, her daughter Clara will die, Percy Shelley will die. So, while it would be, I think, simplistic to suggest that these events alone were the source of Mary Shelley's preoccupation with birth and death in Frankenstein, to disclaim any effect seems unwise. Now, the story of the composition of Frankenstein is famous, at least famous among academics, of Mary and Percy Shelley in Switzerland in the summer of 1816, keeping company with Lord Byron, who was kind of a scamp and a scoundrel of his own sort. So they're keeping company with Byron and John William Polidori, who is Byron's physician. In her introduction to the 1831 edition of the novel, that's the third edition, Mary Shelley recalls that after reading some ghost stories, Byron declares, quote, "We will each write a ghost story." And they all agree. It should always be so easy, right? So we're going to do this, fine. As Mary Shelley summarizes the results of the ghost story contest, she seems proud that she's the only one who completes the task. She writes that Byron produces a fragment that he published with his poem Mazeppa. Shelley started, but did not finish, a story based on the experiences of his early life. And as she puts it, quote, "Poor Polidori had some terrible idea about a skull-headed lady who was so punished for peeping through a keyhole." I can only imagine where that goes. But she also writes in this introduction of her struggles to think of a story. She writes, "I busied myself to think of a story to rival those which had excited us to this task. I thought and pondered vainly. I felt that blank incapability of invention, which is the greatest misery of authorship, when dull nothing replies to our anxious invocations. 'Have you thought of a story?' I was asked each morning, and each morning I was forced to reply with a mortifying negative. Amidst the conversations about science, life, galvanism and electricity amongst the group, Mary has a vision one night. It's a lot of text, I apologize, but I hope it'll be worth it for you. Here's her vision. I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. Frightful must it be, for supremely frightful would be the effect of any human endeavor to mock the stupendous mechanism of the creator of the world. His success would terrify the artist. He would rush away from his odious handiwork, horror-stricken. He would hope that, left to itself, the slight spark of life which he had communicated would fade, that this thing, which had received such imperfect animation, would subside into dead matter, and he might sleep in the belief that the silence of the grave would quench forever that transient existence of the hideous corpse which he had looked upon as the cradle of life. He sleeps, but he is awakened. He opens his eyes. Behold, the horrid thing stands at his bedside, opening his curtains and looking on him with yellow, watery, but speculative eyes. Well, this rendition sounds a bit romantic in the literary sense of the term, and it's certainly very dramatic. There are a number of things worth noting here. First, creation is described as an act that can be hallowed, holy, or not. The pale student of unhallowed arts, kneeling beside the thing he had put together. Divine creation is holy. Human creation? Maybe yes, maybe no. Like the pale student, Mary Shelley will put the thing together, and she will put it together from many sources. And it's kind of a literary game to find the source in Mary Shelley. Because in addition to Godwin and Wollstonecraft, there's Milton, there's Goethe, there's Galvani, there's Humphrey Davy, there's Erasmus. It's like throw a name at a dartboard, and it's somewhere in Frankenstein. She's going to put the thing together from many pieces. Note also that the unhallowed creation is hideous, which may make sense given that this unhallowed creation is mechanical, not natural. Remember, the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then on the working of some powerful engine shows signs of life. And I wonder whether this is the source of the famous scene in the 1931 film, which you saw earlier in that Frankenfest, where, I hope you recall the scene, where in Frankenstein's lab there are all sorts of what seem to our minds to be faux machines and electrical things going up wires, and the creature gets vaulted to the ceiling so he can get struck by lightning. And then when he comes down, Victor cries out, "It's alive, it's alive!" And he's surrounded by machines. That horror of the machine as opposed to the natural is part of this unhallowed act, which is hideous because it looks to supplant God. Notice, the supremely frightful would be the effect of any human endeavor to mock the stupendous mechanism of the creator of the world. It's also striking that creation can be terrifying, like a parent panicking at the birth of a child, at the sudden responsibility for a child, and being implicated in the care and success of the child, or the way a parent panics that a child turns out differently from expectation, or the way an author panics at the response to her writing. Notice the success would terrify the artist. He would rush away from his odious handiwork, horror-stricken. Creators are artists, and artists and writers are creators. The word poet, from the Greek poetas, means maker. It is embedded in Western culture that creators and artists and makers all give birth, all create. They're all metaphors for one another. Last but not least, it strikes me that the child, or the literary work, doesn't go away. Kids stay around, even when you want them to go, right? The horrid thing sits at his bedside, opening his curtains, staring at him. It doesn't leave. Now, I'm partly interpreting the story of Mary Shelley's story of the genesis of her novel in light of that age-old notion that a literary creation is like a child, that we conceive ideas as we conceive children. It's a long-standing pun that goes back to Aristotle. This notion that birth and authorship are metaphors for one another. And I'm partly doing so because that's how Shelley refers to her novel, as her child. By the way, Jane Austen called Pride and Prejudice her darling child. It's not only Mary Shelley, it's a thing. So, in her introduction, she writes, "And now once again I bid my hideous progeny go forth and prosper. I have an affection for it, for it was the offspring of happy days, when death and grief were but words, which found no true echo in my heart." That she characterizes her novel as hideous progeny connects her with Victor Frankenstein, the creator of the hideous phantasm. While in retrospect, Shelley expresses fondness for her creation, I want to suggest that the vision of the creation of the creature resonates with anxieties of authorship. The question every morning, do you have a story? And the implicit question behind the question, is it a good story? And this resonates with the anxieties of parenting. Are your children alive? Are they in trouble? Are they causing trouble? So, with these contextual issues in place, Mary Shelley's biography, the origins of the novel, some basics about the conventions of motherhood in the period, I want to now turn to the novel itself, to Frankenstein. As you may recall, Frankenstein's a novel with three narratives. There's a framing narrative of Captain Walton's quest to reach the pole. There's an inset narrative of Victor Frankenstein's life and death. And then within Victor's narrative, there's an inset narrative of the creature's development and early experience. What you see here is what I call the maternal scorecard for Frankenstein. All the references to mothers, implicit and explicit, biological and surrogate, in the text. As you see in the leftmost column, there are 5 narratives within Frankenstein that feature fathers, in which mothers are not mentioned at all. Even though, given the family orientation of each of these narratives, there must have been a mother at some point. She's simply erased from the narrative. Captain Walton never writes to his sister about their mother, just that their dying father did not want him to go to sea, and he clearly defies that parental injunction. The master of Walton's ship negotiates with his fiancée's father when he learns that she loves another man. There's no mention of the mother in the courtship narrative, in the marital arrangement, or the dissolution of the engagement. And this, too, is a narrative of defying paternal will. Caroline Beaufort is discovered by Alphonse Frankenstein as she is tending to her dying father. Presumably, Mrs. Beaufort is dead. There is no mention of her in the narrative. Victor's boyhood friend, Henry Clerval, has a father who wants him to be a merchant, not a student. Seemingly, Henry's mother has no say in the matter. She's never mentioned. And eventually, Henry will go to university and study, again defying paternal will. And last but not least, the de Lacy family, who are presented as a loving family of father, son, and daughter. No mother is mentioned. Now, these narratives of maternal absence, or perhaps more accurately, narratives of maternal erasure, in column 1, suggest that families can survive without mothers. And in some cases, like the de Lacys, be loving. But all of these family narratives suggest the fragility of the family, whether it's economic fragility in the case of the de Lacys, parental fragility as fathers die in the case of Captain Walton's father and Caroline's father, or in defiance of paternal prerogative, Captain Walton, the master of the ship, Henry Clerval. While these narratives reflect the dominance of patriarchy within the family unit, as decisions are being made by fathers, these narratives suggest that patriarchy is less than secure, and that the parental generation is not in good shape. Seemingly, all these mothers are dead. Whether these families would be better if the mothers were alive is an open question. As is, the mothers don't even register in the narrative. There's no sense that they haunt their children or husbands. They reproduced, and they left. That's it. The second column documents the two maternal deaths that are mentioned retrospectively in Frankenstein: the death of Elizabeth Lavenza's mother during childbirth, and the death of Safi's mother, Safi being the Christian Arab who is Felix de Lacy's beloved. That women died in childbirth was not uncommon. After all, this functionally was what happened to Mary Wollstonecraft. There were some women in the period who wrote their wills when they became pregnant. Think about that. The death of Elizabeth's mother recognizes that biological fact, and her absence from the narrative triggers Elizabeth's fostering first by the peasant family and eventually her adoption by the Frankensteins. The death of Safi's mother is more opaque, for the text provides no cause of death, just a brief narrative of her life. Quote, Safi related that her mother was a Christian Arab, seized and made a slave by the Turks. Recommended by her beauty, she had won the heart of the father of Safi, who married her. The young girl spoke in high and enthusiastic terms of her mother, who, born in freedom, spurned the bondage to which she was now reduced. She instructed her daughter in the tenets of her religion and taught her to aspire to higher powers of intellect and an independence of spirit forbidden to the female followers of Muhammad. This lady died, but her lessons were indelibly impressed on the mind of Safi. Safi's mother functions as an archetype of the good mother, who teaches and cares for her child and provides her child with good principles. And like most good mothers in fiction, she is dead. Well done. This is going to be a refrain. I may call on you to say that again. Dead. She's dead. But at least Safi remembers her mother and tries to live by her principles. And here, too, that means defying her father and a less secure patriarchy as well. That leads us to the third column, the mothers who die in the course of Frankenstein. Caroline Beaufort Frankenstein and Mrs. Moritz embody the good mother, bad mother binary of the period. And as in the case with every binary, it's a lot more nuanced than that. But it's a matter of recognizing the cultural shorthand at work and just working with how it functions. So, Caroline Frankenstein is a loving, doting mother. When Victor recalls his childhood, particularly the years in which he's an only child, he speaks of his mother's tender caresses, that he was his parents' plaything and their idol, the innocent and helpless creature bestowed on them by heaven, whom to bring up to good, and whose future lot it was in their hands to direct to happiness or misery, according as they fulfilled their duties towards me. Victor sees himself as a gift from heaven. I think we all have children like that. I do. He's a gift from heaven, granted to his parents. He sees himself as the center of their attention as they fulfill their duties towards him. He's not thinking of his duties towards them or what's involved in his parents' fulfillment of their role as parents. Even as an adult, as he tells his narrative from the perspective of a child, of a cosseted, spoiled child. Victor describes his parents' active spirit of tenderness from which he received, as he puts it, a lesson of patience, of charity, and of self-control. And subsequent events suggest that he didn't learn that lesson so well, even as he acknowledges receiving it. Now, Caroline Frankenstein, God bless you, Caroline Frankenstein's maternal instincts reach out beyond her biological family. It's Caroline who's motivated to adopt Elizabeth, admittedly because she wants a daughter, along with her son Victor, which might, to someone other than Victor, suggest that maybe Victor is somehow not enough. And as it turns out, she only gives birth to sons, to Victor, Ernest, and William. And it's Caroline who brings Justine Moritz into the family fold when she recognizes that Justine is being abused by her mother. Carolyn Frankenstein nurtures everyone. The cause of Caroline's death fits the archetype of the good mother. She insists on nursing Elizabeth, who contracted scarlet fever, and in the process, Caroline becomes ill with the disease and dies from it. Her deathbed speech exemplifies venerated domestic motherhood of the period. Here's Victor's rendition. On her deathbed, the fortitude and benignity of this best of women did not desert her. She joined the hands of Elizabeth and myself. My children, she said, my firmest hopes of future happiness were placed on the prospect of your union. This expectation will now be the consolation of your father. Elizabeth, my love, you must supply my place to the younger children. Alas, I regret that I am taken from you. And, happy and beloved as I have been, is it not hard to quit you all? But these are not thoughts befitting me. I will endeavor to resign myself cheerfully to death, and will indulge a hope of meeting you in another world. She's dying. But Caroline's thinking about, and she arranges for, the care of her children, the solace of her husband, Victor and Elizabeth's marriage. She's very busy. She's dying, and she's thinking about all of this. And even as she acknowledges herself, I regret that I am taken from you, she states that such thoughts, personal, self-involved thoughts, do not befit her. To the end, Carolyn Frankenstein is a self-effacing, caregiving, self-erasing mother. She demonstrates motherhood by displacing herself. And it's interesting that Caroline thinks she's replaceable, as if mothers were fungible and exchangeable. And she believes that she has the authority to designate her replacement. Now, Caroline Frankenstein dies early in the novel. In the Penguin Classics edition, she dies on page 45, and the novel starts on page 15. And it's well over 200 pages. So this is early. But her memory reverberates afterwards, as if the role of a good mother is to be a good memory that brings comfort, and potentially a guide. Absent, but fondly remembered. But Caroline is irreplaceable. Despite Elizabeth's efforts to fulfill Caroline's role, she never quite succeeds. Her loss is never compensated, and she haunts the text. After Caroline's death, she's evoked through images, two pictorial images in particular of Caroline Frankenstein occur in the novel, and they're both problematic. The first is the miniature with her portrait that her son William carries, and that the creature puts in Justine's pocket after he's killed William. The creature, yeah, it's kind of like that. The creature takes the portrait of Carolyn Frankenstein, says, wow, she's beautiful, decides it's not for him, puts it in Justine's pocket, and by doing so, that helps convict Justine for William's murder. The second is the portrait that Alphonse Frankenstein commissioned, in which Caroline is mourning for her father. And it's that portrait that Victor views when he finally returns home from university. Both images enable Caroline to haunt her family, whether it's through her lost beauty, as pictured in the miniature, or by depicting her sorrow as beautiful. Neither image is particularly maternal, but rather they seem to represent an ideal or an idealized femininity. The images are reminders of loss, and neither helps her family. The images do not protect them, they don't teach them, and ultimately, they don't comfort her family either. Mrs. Moritz, Justine's mother, is Caroline Frankenstein's antithesis. A widow with 4 children, she despises her daughter, Justine, who had been her father's favorite. And we know, and this goes back certainly to the Bible, to the Joseph story in Genesis, we know that favoritism is always a dangerous thing for parents and children. When Justine's siblings die, and they all die, a lot of death in this novel, they all die, her mother wonders whether that's a divine judgment. But Justine is summoned home to tend to her dying mother, much as she nursed Carolyn Frankenstein in her final illness. But unlike Caroline, Mrs. Martz is unkind to her daughter to the end, accusing Justine of being the cause of her siblings' death. There is no logic in that accusation, but, my favorite kids are gone, you're still here, I hate you, therefore you must be the reason why your siblings are dead. There it is. There's no deathbed speech, no self-effacement for Mrs. Moritz, just anger and frustration and the sense that she's being punished for her willfulness. While Mrs. Moritz does not have much of a narrative in the novel, the narrative she has is that of a bad mother, selfish, willful, thinking of herself rather than her children first. She is monstrous in her presence, and it's a relief when she dies. If Carolyn Frankenstein is the archetype of the good mother of the novel, then it's not surprising that so many of the surrogate mother figures in Frankenstein, Elizabeth, Justine, and Henry in the fourth column, share her traits of tending to the ill, putting others' needs before their own, and dying. I don't think Mary Shelley anticipated the potential comedy here. She couldn't imagine Mel Brooks, but I'm glad that you appreciate this, because I do too. So, the only mother figure who is not explicitly stated as being dead by the end of the novel is the peasant woman who fostered Elizabeth. So, it seems that the answers to the questions in my title, O Mother, what art thou? And O Mother, where art thou? are, Mom is a corpse, and she's in the graveyard. And I am sorry to report that these answers are cognate with much of Western literature, the literature that features orphans that make their way in the world. Think of the protagonists of Dickens' novels. Think of Harry Potter. Think of Marvel superheroes. They're all orphans. This is cognate with the literature of courtship, which focuses on the younger generation rather than the parental generation. And the parents usually get in the way, as in Romeo and Juliet. Or the parents are simply absent, and you see this in Shakespeare's comedies, you see this in the works of Jane Austen, you see this in probably every rom-com that's ever been created. Last but not least, and as mentioned before, we see this sense of maternal death being pervasive in the literature of wicked step-parenting. I submit to you that these answers are not very satisfying, not only because there are living mothers, like me, like many of you, who would like and need to have their stories told, but because it does not allow for the representation or analysis of families that are commonplace. That answer is a problem. So we can't get at the stories that are families not only with mothers and fathers, but the stories of single-parent, maternally-led households, or stories of families with two mothers. We just can't. So it seems to me that Mary Shelley takes the answer that the good mother is self-effacing, self-erasing, and dead, and that everybody wants the bad mother to be dead since she's so mean, and she pushes it to its logical extreme. If mothers are dead, what does society do without them? And this is where Victor comes in. You will notice that I have not included him on the chart because he does not fulfill the biological function of a mother, certainly not in the strict sense of the term, nor the nurturing function of a mother as depicted in the novel. Recall that Victor goes to university right after his mother's death, while he is still mourning the loss of his mother. And that helps shape his identity. As he learns from Professor Waldman that science can penetrate into the recesses of nature and show how she works in her hiding places, a rather sexualized notion of scientific method as masculine science penetrates feminized nature, Victor decides that he will, quote, pioneer a new way, explore unknown powers, and unfold to the world the deepest mysteries of creation. Waldman doesn't tell him to study creation. Victor decides to study creation. God creates, artists create, authors create, and by giving birth, mothers create as well. The mysteries of creation are not only creating new life, but seemingly for Victor, revivifying the dead. As Victor remarks, a new species would bless me as its creator and source. Many happy and excellent natures would owe their being to me. No father could claim the gratitude of his child so completely as I should deserve theirs. Pursuing these reflections, I thought that if I could bestow animation upon lifeless matter, I might, in process of time, although I now found it impossible, renew life where death had apparently devoted the body to corruption. Or to put it differently, Victor may want to be a god, but he may also want to be his mother. After all, he envisions being more than a father, as no father could claim the gratitude of his child so completely. And he may also want to bring his mother back, as he envisions renewing life where death had devoted the body to corruption. His mother's just died. That Victor fails spectacularly at this task is the heart of the novel. Victor is thinking of his needs, his desires, his expectations, not of the being he's creating, which is his child, or his creation's needs, wants, or desires. Victor imagines gratitude from a child, from his creation, but not the time, effort, and energy involved in parenting, and not the tenderness of mothering that he experienced from his mother, and that characterizes the primary surrogate mothers of the text, Elizabeth, Justine, and Henry. In this sense, Victor remains a child. He sees himself at the center of the narrative, not recognizing that being a creator and being a parent involves responsibility, not just kudos for creating or giving birth. His vision of parenting is that his creation will adore him, not that, God bless you, that he will have obligations to his creation. So while Victor's creation of the creature echoes aspects of pregnancy, the 3 seasons in his lab comparable to 9 months of gestation, his slow fever, sleeplessness, anxiety, and preoccupation, comparable to the experience of many women during pregnancy, or the fact that he refers repeatedly to his labor in the lab, the birth of the creature is a sad parody of maternal experience. It's not surprising that after the creature is born, Victor dreams of Elizabeth dying from his kiss, and of his dead mother in his arms, the maggots moving in and out of her body. He dreams of the important women in his life, who are maternal. He does not dream of his father, his brothers, his professors, or his best friend Clerval. He envisions himself as an agent of death, not of creation and life. Nor is it surprising that Victor experiences a form of postpartum depression, as he is ill for months and tended to by Clerval, and he has anxiety about his creation, his child, even as he rejects it, and his role as a parent. Victor has benefited from domesticity and from the good mother, but he does not enact those values. His creature and his long-standing silence about the creature are unlike the modest silence of the domestic woman. His silence and his creature wreak havoc and destroy family and domesticity. Victor's creature is monstrous, and Victor is monstrous as well, for he prioritizes himself and his needs, and he demonstrates loudly and clearly. And Victor is a warning of what happens when ego and knowledge get out of control. As the novel progressively eliminates mothers and mothering from the narrative, Mary Shelley questions the conventions and expectations of motherhood in her time. And remember, she's doing this while she's pregnant and tending to a small child. The novel asks, what constitutes mothering? Who decides what constitutes mothering? What makes a good mother good and a bad mother bad? And who decides those things? What is the narrative of the good mother? Is there more than one good narrative for a mother? When and how does that narrative get told? And if the best mother is a dead one, where does that leave us? What is the narrative of the bad mother? Is there more than one? How are the bad mother's stories told? How are families and society affected by mothers and motherhood? And what happens to families and society when biological and surrogate mothers are eliminated? What happens when mothers' voices are silenced? Mary Shelley's answers to these questions are, of necessity, a function of her history and her context. But given the eminence of Frankenstein in Western culture, her answers about the chaos and monstrosity that comes in the wake of eliminating motherhood are part of our cultural history, and they shape our thinking. But we are still asking these questions because they're central to the human experience, and they shape our ongoing conversation about motherhood, which since the turn of the 21st century has become more contentious and has been denominated mommy wars. By mommy wars, I mean the conversation about mothers and by mothers, about mothering and maternal experience in all of its forms. Biological mothers, mothers with fertility problems, surrogate mothers, stepmothers, foster mothers, single mothers, lesbian mothers, working mothers, stay-at-home mothers, tiger mothers, I can keep going, helicopter mothers, all of it. This is a multifaceted conversation with economic, religious, medical, sexual, educational, political, social, psychological, and cultural elements that shape expectations of mothers and mothering. Aspects of Shelley's life and work, particularly the conventions of the domestic mother, the stresses of being a working mother, the public-private binary of gender, and the erasure of maternal authority and voice, these are still very much a part of the current conversation. Given the array of modern mothers and mothering, it may be inevitable that the modern conversation of motherhood is contentious and marked by judgment, as people judge others who do not mother as they do or as they expect, or as people explain and justify the ways that they mother. Mothers, and those who have particular opinions about mothers and mothering, seem to be jostling for validation. But in the cacophony of voices, it is far from clear that they are getting it. The desire to have specific standards and to regulate mothers and mothering is powerful. Even the basic consensus that a parent should tend to a child's physical and psychological well-being is fraught with disagreement about how to do so. Think about the arguments about breastfeeding and inoculation, for starters, and who has or who claims the authority to decide such matters. Not surprisingly, the mommy wars are marked by offensiveness, both giving and taking umbrage, and by defensiveness, as the mommy wars express and perpetuate the current dissensus regarding mothers and motherhood. But the conversation about motherhood is both necessary and important, because if we don't have the conversation, Mary Shelley has shown us the consequences. Thank you. So I am curious about your thoughts about the mommy wars. And monstrosity, and mothers, in any combination thereof. Yes?
Reading a lot of adult education classes, a lot of Russian fiction,
Mm-hmm.
and specifically much of the country, also called Two Women by Turgenev. And the pattern is the Russian woman is educated, and then she marries a landowner, and then she has children, and then what? Her whole higher self is nothing for her to do. She doesn't work, and she doesn't really need to work. And then so some other dude generally shows up, and Francus is a similar.
Yeah.
And well, where's that going to go? Well, Mary Shelley, eloped with Percy Shelley, was a great poet, so that's an answer. You know, sort of. And Anna Karenina, well, doesn't work out too well, and, you know, you can't integrate the educated woman and her sexuality, if you will, and because it wrecks the family. So now we're gay, and the woman is liberated, but the family is not totally happy about that. Who's taking care of the children? Well, the screen is taking care of the children these days, and most people aren't married, or many fewer marriages, and well over 50% of children are born out of wedlock. That would have stunned this culture in the 19th century. Freaked out at that. Now, no big deal. Which is, well, but who's then responsible for the children and their caretaking? So I wanted a collectivization, the women come together, raise again, and of course nobody does that. So I don't think anybody's parenting the children now. So that's kind of the catch with the whole movement to liberate the women is then, well, what do you do about children and some kind of social order, if you will? That's all. Makes big problems that I believe not resolve.
I think you're right. I think it's very much a work in progress, partly because, at least from the data I have experientially, there are multiple ways to parent, and everybody feels under siege. No matter which way they do it, no matter which subject position they take. So the stay-at-home moms feel like they're being looked down upon by the working moms. The working moms feel like they're guilty because they're not stay-at-home moms. The single women in the workplace resent the women who are parents because they think they have to do more work to cover for the working moms. The working moms feel guilty about that. It spins out in multiple ways, and I think part of it is that we haven't figured out ways, as you suggest, to raise families and be responsible. And there are multiple ways of doing it. I think it's plural. I really do. Fathering's changing. Social networks are changing. Honestly, and this is simply my opinion, I think there are certain things that we don't do well as a country that other countries do better. When I talk to colleagues in Canada, in England, they are stunned by what maternity leave is in this country. They're like, how can you possibly tolerate that? So there may be social ways in addition to individual ways that we can start doing this, but until we can talk it out in civil ways and actually grapple with specific context, I think we're going to have the kind of flaming blog wars that you see online, where, you know, somebody will post something and then 15 people will jump on that person, then 15 more people will jump in defense, and we're not getting at problem solving. So thank you. Yes?
I think, well, you just mentioned social media, but I'm part of a larger group online that's a child-free communities.
Mm-hmm.
And we often find ourselves clashing, especially mothers on, well, you're one of the younger people here, but that we always get pushed on, like, oh, you'll change your mind when you're young, you'll change your mind when you meet the right person about having kids and all that. And so we see this, you know, and then we talk about these types of things, we see this onslaught of parenting, like now with the people, millennials, this online slot of like parenting has become who they are. They've lost any other, like, they've lost, like I'll talk to some of my friends that have kids, there's no inkling of who they were 10 years ago. And I don't know, have you encountered that anyway? Like, it's all they do is they post about their kids, they post about like, oh, look, so-and-so, what they pooped in the toilet today, it's like all on. That's all it is.
I'm not interested in somebody's
Yeah.
work in the toilet.
See, this is what my generation, the
Yeah.
millennials, like, this is like who my female friends have become. College-educated women, this is like all they're posting now. And so, like, I don't know what to
Yeah.
do with it. And I'm like, you used to be an interesting person. We used to have intelligent conversations. So I don't, and they get defensive about it when we bring these things up. And they like, we don't want to talk to you. You don't have kids. You don't understand.
Oh, that's, see, and
And so
That's
I
a-
don't
that-
know how
yes.
this conversation started.
but those conversations, what you're describing happens all the time. And it's incredibly daunting. What I could suggest is And when you're assuming you want to pursue your relationships with your friends who are parents, instead of saying to them, you used to be an interesting person, try to talk to them about something interesting, because while they may be sending you the signal, and it's an unfortunate signal, oh, you don't get it because you're a parent, because there's certain things that you don't have to be a parent to get, quite frankly. I've also had friends who get so pulled into the work of parenting that until they have an intelligent conversation with an adult, they're like, oh, I can still do that. And it's a matter of achieving that balance. But what you're describing is partly the defensiveness that I'm hearing in the national conversation. The, oh, you don't get it because you don't do it. No, we can do more than that, I think. We can do better than that.
Do you think social media has just like upped the ante on that?
Okay. My instinct is yes, but I should tell you that I am not a particular social media guru. And my instinct is that social media has made discourse in our country, just in general, more aggressive. And I don't think that that's a parenting thing in particular. We're very quick on the draw with tweets, with emails, and perhaps if we slowed down a little bit and maybe thought a little bit more before we posted things, it might be better. Yes.
So I'm sort of thinking about, one of the things that I guess made me think about is to what degree are the narratives that are available shaping the way we take on roles like motherhood? If we really have these sort of bifurcated narratives, how much does that shape our ways of imagining what it means to be a mother?
I think it shapes them incredibly strongly, and this is what this young lady is talking about, because if you've got people who assume that the minute you're a mother, you could like suck down the mommy rabbit hole, and that's all you can do, and that you can't do anything else, it's closing up other opportunities and options and other ways of interpreting motherhood. I guess part of my concern, and this is why I signaled how much of this tends to be class-based. I mean, working class mothers in our society today, they don't have the luxury of just doing mothering all the time because they're working, and their sets of issues and concerns and problems are very different from the upper middle class woman who can, she can do it on herself, and she's, forgive me, almost stereotypically, worried about things like, are the cupcakes right for the next school product? I mean, it's an enormous stereotype. Recognize that those are stereotypes. But I think if we can start working through ways that are beyond those hidebound narratives and beyond those binaries, because we don't really live like that. It seems to me that you may be parenting at one kind of style one time in your life and another style in another time, depending on your circumstances. It's not an absolute. Yes?
Then there's the role of the school teacher that takes on mothering or fathering, if the case may be, as a role model. When suddenly decide subject matter, you're teaching hygiene and citizenship and behavior. Here's the new aspect of mothering.
I think that's right. In fact, I was just reading a piece today from a West Virginia school teacher. They just finished a strike in West Virginia, and she was talking about worrying about the food security of her students and bringing food to school for her students and worrying on weekends and occasionally buying clothes for her students because they didn't have. So yes, teaching particularly, and again, that's why it's, even in the late 18th century, is quasi-domestic in that way. That can help support parents, but it's not the same. And I am a teacher, but I think there's only so much we can ask of teachers, and then there's the question of how we're supporting our teachers to do the work that they're supposed to be doing, and supporting our students. So, yes.
Your discussion and presentation were so important to me. I would like to ask you, where can I digest this at leisure so that I can understand? You have so much deep information. I'd like to digest it.
I'm happy to send you a copy of my paper. Sure, and happy of the PowerPoint, of course. Of course. Honestly, I was concerned it was a lot of data. And for some authors, the biography is not necessarily as directly relevant to the subject. But in the case of Mary Shelley, it's hard not to grapple with it, simply because her mother was such a towering figure. And then you think, well, she was pregnant, and then a child died, and then she's pregnant, and she's doing childcare. And it's difficult to get away. So I realized that there was a lot of hard data. But sure, if you, afterwards, I'm happy if you give me an email or a snail mail, I will send you a copy of the paper. Absolutely, absolutely. Yes?
Just a quick comment about, I am grandmother.
Yay! I hope to do that someday.
I was raising my children. I had a husband who was pretty much absent in doing a lot of things with children. My daughters, I have two daughters. My daughters, however, have husbands who are very active in doing a lot of the mothering. And as a matter of fact, one of them is a stay-at-home dad.
Hmm.
And he has taken on a tremendous amount in that role. So I see when there are partners involved, there can be, as you said, it takes a village.
Yeah. And the stay-at-home dad thing is a comparatively new phenomenon. And when it started, and I bet you recall this too, when it started, men got teased mercilessly about it because it was perceived as defying a social stereotype.
Interestingly, my husband is not fond, well, I shouldn't say that, was not pleased that our daughter was the breadwinner of the family,
Mhm.
and her husband was staying, my son-in-law was staying home too.
Yeah, and that's, I think part of that's generational, but that's also common. But I would say, again, as a broad generalization, we feel enormous economic pressure in this country, and often both people need to be working. Yes, Ron.
I was struck by a whole bunch of what you talked about, but it reminded me about a century and a half after this, there was a mid-late 19th century novel by a couple, but I think it's mostly Dr. Thorne. There's a secondary character who is a working class woman
Mhm.
who has a young child and is also hired out to be a wet nurse to the son of the squire, to the point where her son's health is declined. It's detrimental to her son's health in later life. He becomes a terrible drunk. But she loves the squire's kid. And what's interesting is at one point her husband then becomes rich, so her class changes. And she is at a loss when she is, when there are servants to do the mother work. So there's in this one secondary character, there's a whole bunch of this. It's a very, she's very positive character, but you see all this problematic mother stuff.
It's problematic. It still is problematic. And this goes all the way back. Yes. Other question? Yes.
Picking up on her comment, but going the reverse, you have grandmothers raising the
Yes.
younger generation with the gap of a generation in between. And you've got two entirely different sets of morals and cultural definitions, to consider. And the
You're right.
strain that puts on the elderly grandmother now having to keep active is really not fair to her either.
I agree, and I suspect that's also family and context dependent too. A lot of this requires a lot of communication, I think, and communication often about things that are really difficult. I suspect it's very hard to say to your child, well, you want me to raise my grandchild, I think you turned out okay, you should trust me. And then if they're not happy with the way they were raised for whatever reason, the multi-generational thing it adds a whole nother layer to this. But you're right.
Between Sarasota and Manatee counties, you've got 1,600 children in foster care. And so you have another issue there with foster parents.
Sure.
Trying to deal with these parents
Yes.
And, I'm sure there's a lot of children not adjusting well with that whole process.
I absolutely agree. And it's a difficult adjustment.
Yes.
It's difficult to expect that of a child. And to have the framework and the support, we have a long way to go. A long way to go. Oh. Thank you for having me.